right, I am here with Jeffrey Stuffings of Jester King Brewery, just outside of Austin, Texas. Hill Country, you call it.
Yes, from the Texas Hill Country. It's great to be here with you, Michael.
All right.
It's been a while.
Tell us a little bit about, before anybody gobbles it up too quickly here, tell us about Black Atrial, what we're drinking today, why this is what we've tapped, and this has a bit of a history with the brewery.
Yes, and just to be totally transparent, and I'm not sure how this transpired, it's not a wild ale. It's a barrel-aged imperial stout re-fermented with raspberries, monoculture fermentation. So a little awkward having that as a special tapping at Foeder for thought, but I guess it is what it is, and we do have some true wild ales on.
Yeah.
Besides that one.
I think it's it's perhaps apt in the broader mix of what you've been producing the last couple of years. As I think starting from this passion for wild ales, the offering of the brewery has grown not just in terms of the beers you make, but in a variety of ways. So a place like this has always had a home, or a beer like this, and increasingly so maybe, in the overall offering of what Jester King has been producing.
Yes, I mean, we try to be very transparent about what we make, how we make it, and why. And we are a brewery that focused exclusively on mixed culture wild fermentation for the better part of a decade, from 2010 until 2019. In 2019, we started to, per the conversation we were going to have 2 years ago, mix in some clean beer into our portfolio. And we've done that, I would say, as part of a larger theme I've identified in the beer industry of craft breweries becoming more kind of community centers, just as much as production breweries. I mean, look at this beautiful environment here at Green Bench. We feel like we're in the backyard of the brewery here, and that type of feel. Is the mic working?
Yeah, you're fine.
Oh, okay, good. That kind of feel we have here is very, I think, emblematic of, a very important trend in craft beer of just kind of creating community. I mean, that's kind of what we ultimately want to do, and to do that, we realize that although I would argue, Petit Prince, our Franco-Belgian style table beer, is just as drinkable as practically any beer out there. Mixed fermentation isn't necessarily for everyone. So, we've started to do some pure culture fermentation. By volume, it's about 30% of what we do. So relatively small. We're a 2,500 barrel a year brewery. We've been at that level for, about a decade.
Yeah, for a long time.
We've started to make some pale ales, IPAs, lagers, pure culture stouts, but still keeping it pretty just low gravity and drinkable, and just for everyday beer drinking.
I think it's interesting for anybody who's somewhat newish to Jester King, and for some folks maybe it's their first time. I think it's important to put you in the context of a timeline in American craft brewing. I mean, 2010 producing these kinds of beers was not only a rarity, it was an exceptional rarity. I think for a festival like this to even exist in 2022 was a bit of a pipe dream back then. Help me understand what it was like in that context to be producing these beers and trying to educate about them versus what it's like now to sort of maybe be able to just enjoy being one of the kids at the park, as it were.
Yeah, that's framed very well, and that's exactly really what happened, where as a home brewer, getting into the industry, and my background wasn't in home brewing, you would start obviously making pale ales and English styles and just like simple drinkable ales, and it wasn't too long beyond that I discovered, I was living in Chicago at the time, and I discovered Jolly Pumpkin, and that was really kind of the first step down the rabbit hole of wild fermentation. And then, expanding beyond that at the time, I got to discover really conveniently, a lot of these producers are here this evening. I got to discover beers from Lost Abbey, Allagash, Russian River, Crooked Stave, which is starting up at the time. And then there was the European tradition as well. I mean, there's several, traditional lambics being poured tonight. So kind of discovering what was the American scene at the time, discovering, what had been around for, decades, if not centuries, as part of the European tradition, and really just becoming enamored with making those styles. And also being in Texas at the time, where there weren't hardly any wild ale producers, and wanting to do something just at least as far as statewide, that was new and unique. And
the way I've always thought about it was during this sort of spike of American craft brewing in general that happened over the past maybe 15 years, there were a lot of people that maybe rushed into a space with a lot of passion and excitement that were sort of the moment, and then there were others that were sort of working at the same time, but were maybe thinking about things on a much longer timeline. I don't know. For me, it's the difference between like a shooting star and a constellation, right? Like there's a bunch of noise, there's a bunch of activity in a space, but other things have been there forever. I think it's indicative now. I think in 2022 we can start to see the difference between those approaches, and who is maybe struggling a little bit to sell enough to support the model that they've created, and who's maybe going deeper on the things that they care about that were maybe part of the vision from the day one that had nothing to do with how much they were producing, but how they were making it, who it was for, and building a sort of bigger picture around those things. Jester King strikes me as somebody that saw themselves as part of a much longer timeline, and there's some humility in that, I would think.
No, I think that's fair. I mean, we kind of had the feeling that we're going to make wild ales and have that to be the focus of what we do, even though, again, I would argue that for the vast majority of our history, we feel like we're just making, hoppy table beers and hoppy kind of medium strength farmhouse ales. And to me, those are some of the most drinkable beers on the planet. So with that said, fermentation wise, in terms of the fermentation character, it's not necessarily going to appeal to everyone. And at the time we felt like, number one, we're going to be small. I mean, our business plan essentially was making about 800 beer barrels a year for the first 3 to 4 years. And so there was that, and then there was also through my one of the former partners in Jester King, Ron Extract, who is with Garden Path in Washington. We kind of felt that there was a avenue beyond Texas, and Christian, formerly of Shelton Brothers, now from Dre Fontaine, is here tonight, and so we felt there was a way to kind of get our beer beyond our market if we needed to, especially since at the time it was actually illegal to sell a drop of beer at our brewery in Texas. Thankfully, Texas locals came out and supported us from day one. It was a pleasant surprise where we never felt that need to really, sell a lot of beer beyond our own brewery, and that continues to this day. I mean, yes, we're focused on making farmhouse ales, but nowadays, I mean, we run a restaurant, an event center, an inn, have on-site event programming where, I feel like we're very much like a communal hub.
How important has it been to you? I would imagine you learned a lot about your audience over the years, and I think in the beginning it was maybe easy to see your audience as being a very niche audience. People who are willing to drive out into hill country to get just these kinds of beers, kind of in isolation. But over the years, I mean, it seems like you're building almost like a nice, smooth ramp to some of those things through the clean beer program, the food and hospitality, the inn. It seems like one of the things you're accomplishing beyond just making a cool experience is just making it easier and more accessible for more people to enjoy these without the requirement for them to have a personal knowledge and drive for the niche quality of these things.
No, that's very accurate. I mean, our customers at Jester King have kind of merged over the years from, I would say, kind of like hardcore beer geeks, lining up for the latest release, and what our former taproom manager used to analogize it with. We were a brewery that kind of thrived, to use a baseball analogy, by hitting home runs. There would be this kind of lull in sales, and then a special release would come out, and we'd have an influx of cash, and then slow sailing until the next kind of big hit. Where now we're kind of, Moneyball is just like grinding out, runs.
Or lack of Moneyball.
Yeah, right. Yeah, lack of money. So it's more of just, a consistent business, which again, when you come out to our brewery, some of those like familiar faces who are lining up, time and time again for releases, you might not see them as much, but I saw a group of kids just over there on the ground with their coloring books, and I'm like, oh, that looks like Jester King.
Yeah.
So I mean, we're very much just kind of like a family hub.
I mean, when you're first starting something like Jester King, I mean, and I've known a lot of small breweries this way, and some cider makers as well, that like there's an ultimate vision you have for sort of like what the space and the land can mean. but you can't get there on day one. Sometimes you can't get there on year 10. It takes a long time for these slow things to start to emerge. What was your picture that you had in your head when you were first starting Jester King of some of those things, and maybe which things have surprised you along the way in the way that they actually ultimately had developed?
Sure. Initially it was hyper beer driven. We wanted to really be taken seriously as a wild ale producer. I was totally infatuated with those breweries I mentioned, who are our main inspirations, like Jolly Pumpkin and Allagash and Russian River. And although they came before us, we really, and maybe it was ego, I don't know what, but we really did want to be regarded as like a top farmhouse producer in the country, and wanted to gain the respect of some of the European counterparts who'd met along the way. And so really just poured all our energy into just being really regarded as a great, if you will, brewer. And then really kind of just rode that train for, I would say, the better part of a decade, maybe to like 2016 or 17. And we definitely had some tailwinds by being able to sell beer and some of the deregulation that occurred in Texas. Without that, it would have been a struggle no matter how well regarded our beer was. But then, around, kind of 2017-ish, the market started to change a little bit where, the beer releases weren't quite as impactful. Some of that era was kind of coming out of the balloon. Some of the large format, sales were starting to lag, even for a very small producer like us. And so that kind of led us into pivoting to where we are today, where we, opened a restaurant. It was a pre-existing one, but we took it over, started adding, on-site events and programming, kind of developed a little bit more wider, broader scope of business, which, I still feel have mixed feelings about, because, what am I still most passionate about? It's just making beer. If I had nothing else to worry about but just making beer, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, where does all of that sort of empire building, where does all of that add complexity that is maybe not so desirable, and where does it add some value to you personally that maybe you do derive some value from?
I think in kind of building a broader team and getting to try to achieve, good culture, which could be a whole panel in and of itself. That has been both challenging and fulfilling. Having trying to have good people who have clear focus and direction, and then the tools and freedom that they need to really thrive. That's where a lot of my time and kind of mental energy and emotional energy is focused these days. I still love Friday. I get to sit down and basically spend the whole day just working with our brew team on what we're doing next week, how we're going to do it, where are all of our beers at, what's doing well, what maybe isn't doing so well, where do the new creative challenges lie. I wish every day could be that day, but that usually turns out to just be a fraction of the work week now, where I've been forced, I say forced, but it's also been fun to kind of just try to, learn how to be a business person versus, just brewer. And, I think if there's kind of a theme as the craft beer industry matures, it's that we've, kind of collectively have had to learn how to run better businesses than, just exclusively focus on making beer. I mean, I feel like for a time there, as you're kind of going through this almost like this tornado kind of just rise, this new wave of craft beer, not just for wild beers, but just across the board, where we went from 1,700 breweries when we started to now over 8,000, where you could always pretty much just worry about just making good beer, and the rest would kind of take care of itself. And now with over 8,000 breweries, you really do have to be mindful of all aspects of business.
Quickly that not a lot of it got taken care of.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
In a variety of ways. Yeah, I mean, how much of your brain is devoted, what percentage would you say is now devoted to thinking about goats?
Oh, as far as agriculture, Jester King, I'm grateful that I have very limited knowledge as far as that. I mean, I'm passionate about viticulture and trying to learn more about that, because making natural wines is something I feel is closely associated with making farmhouse ales, and that aspect of agriculture I am passionate about. But as far as the goats, I just see them as a vehicle to start fermenting milk and making cheese, where that is once we can introduce fermentation, that's when I start to get interested again.
Are any of these things that things that became interesting to you over time as you? I don't know. I would imagine for me a journey, for example, through fermentation, it's led me to drink wines differently, ciders differently, foods. I consume differently than I otherwise would have had I not had the experience of coming up through beer and really appreciating those things. Are any of those things that are like kind of new on your journey through fermentation as a producer, or were they always there to begin with for you? Like, what's that piece been like for you?
Just finding different mediums to apply wild yeast to, or spontaneous fermentation is still a huge fascination.
Yeah.
Texas, as I mentioned, has progressed legally, where 2019, we can start doing wine and cider and mead under the same roof. And that's been just a huge just kind of boost of creative energy to start making wine.
Yeah.
We're 2 harvests in 2020 and 2021. We've planted our own vineyard. I feel like just the parallels, I kind of mentioned this before, but the parallels with, winemaking, especially, people quibble over the terminology, but, natural winemaking is so closely associated with wild beer, especially having done just a boatload of fruit re-fermentation over the years. I was just drinking the Tilken Pinot Noir blend, and, just the parallels to, wild wine fermentation and beer. It's such a close overlap where, I'm looking at, Ashley and Bill there in the crowd, where having to try to, attempt to learn how to make lagers has felt, infinitely harder than to try to make the bridge to making, wine from making farmhouse ales.
Lager doesn't really want to be made, does it? By comparison, no. Fruit's going to get there one way or another. I find it fascinating that over the years we've talked so much on, during conversations like this and interviews about the vocabulary of wild beers and how we're going to talk to them and how consumers might think about them, and the disconnect that can sometimes be there, with the words like sour, whether that sounds good to lots of people is a big question. And natural wine just came along with a term like natty. Just natty. Doesn't mean anything to anybody, but it just fucking clicked, right? And all of a sudden it's 10 times as big as wild ale ever can hope to be, maybe.
Oh, yeah.
And it did it in a generation. And I think that it's just fascinating to me as somebody, who works linguistically, that a word like that can just catch fire and mean so much and so little at the same time to so many people. But it gets them in the door and gets them interested, and all of a sudden there's an industry there, there's a market there that allows people to explore and play with new things. I got to imagine that door being open for you as a wild ale producer, to be able to now have a drinker who's at least heard the word natty wine, whether they know what it is or care what it is a different question, but they've heard it and they're interested. I would imagine that almost gives you a bit of a side hug into wild ale for that customer who might, maybe is coming along with a beer friend to Jester King and knows about natty wine, and you have that for them, and then they could also use that as a way into some other things that you're doing. What has it been like for you to see that, has that customer base started to show up a little bit? Are you starting to see those conversations and those journeys happening kind of in short notice?
Yeah, I feel that customer has been fairly consistent over the years, where someone who, is that classic, like, oh, I don't like beer, I don't drink beer, but then you kind of introduce them to wild fermentation, especially wild fermentation re-fermented with fruit, and it starts to click a little bit. So, kind of offering those parallels for wine drinkers has been valuable. As far as the terminology, I'm not as kind of passionate or willing to fight over it as I used to be. With that said, I do find myself slipping into vocabulary of just saying, oh, this is a natural ferment. Even though I have to kind of guard against that a little bit, because what you just said rings true in my mind of what does that even mean?
Right.
I find myself mainly reverting back to just, this is a wild fermentation. If you ask me to define it, I would just say simply, as the Jeff Sparrow book does, the world beyond pure culture brewers yeast. Just introducing something then other than monoculture brewers yeast. And I'll be one of the first to defend monoculture brewers yeast as something that can achieve amazing complexity in beer. But wild ale is just a different category. It's not better or worse. It's just different.
Yeah.
And it does, I think, open up the artist's palate a little bit, if you will. And I don't know. We've always just kind of embraced that kind of, the theme of this event tonight, kind of that more hands-off approach to brewing. I respect, the very orderly, consistent, predictable path And then I also, love and have my true passion for kind of that more wild, hands-off approach and just kind of being interested what develops. Is this batch of Petite Prince going to taste anything like the last one? Maybe not, and that's okay.
I think being in a defensive position over a category is almost always a losing battle. It doesn't mean that it's a winning battle to give in, because you're not in control of it. It reminds me of when we were doing the Uppers and Downers Festival for coffee beers. A few brewers had started using Cascara for the first time, and they were having a very hard time explaining to people what Cascara even was, which is like the red cherry sort of fleshy part of a coffee bean. But then 2 years later, Starbucks came out with a Cascara latte or something, and nobody had to explain what Cascara was anymore. And like the value of having somebody like Starbucks with a marketing budget like Starbucks to put the word Cascara in everybody's mouths is a phenomenal opportunity for anybody that wants to use that. Now, along with that, of course, comes the baggage of like, no, this is not a fucking Starbucks latte. But I would almost rather have to fight that battle than have to explain what it is to begin with most people. But that reminds me a little bit with what the word natural fermentation has done with between wine and beer is doesn't explain everything, and it adds its own complexity and problems, but it turns heads, and you have some attention for the first time maybe in a minute.
Yeah, I mean, to the extent that we are kind of even still like fighting over terminology, I still feel a little passionate over what you said a moment ago, which is farmhouse doesn't equal sour, spontaneous doesn't equal sour. I mean, I can't tell you how many people have come up to us and said, oh, you make sour beer, right? And yeah, there is some natural acidity in our beer, but we make a lot of mixed firm hoppy beers as well that, really are just, really old school pilsners and pale ales. I mean, all beer was mixed culture at some point. So, and I mean, a lot of these beers we make, if you drink them within the first 4 to 6 weeks, there's going to be very little perceivable acidity.
Yeah.
They're just going to be hoppy ales. It's only with time and maturation that they develop that acidity, and that can be beautiful as well. And by the barrel aged beers, we absolutely like lean into the tartness.
I mean, acidity is structure, and the same thing is going to be true of natty wines. Is a lot of those just taste like fruit falling off the table. It doesn't have a lot of structure yet. Some of them get pretty messy as well. But I don't know. It's a consumer that seems interested in exploring, which is some new energy at least. I'm interested. Last time we talked, and I think it was the last time we were here. We were talking about climate change. I think, even then it was still very difficult to get people to think about that and consider that. Still is in a lot of weird ways. But I know one of the things we talked about was its influence over your ability to brew in certain ways and how you were adapting to sort of a localized interpretation of a lot of these things that, if you wanted to produce the beer in the vein of the inspiration of a lot of Belgian and European brewers that you loved, some of those things weren't going to be able to be achieved through traditional means in the same climate because you're in Texas of all, it's not going to happen there. Right. That's only going to increasingly become true, I would imagine. So what are some things that you've started to see in your own process and your approach that are making this a little bit more of a Jester King, Texas climate kind of thing, especially as we roll into the future where what that climate is and what it enables you to do is only getting more and more difficult to track?
Yes. I mean, our winters have been... despite a few extreme weather events, which I know are not indicative of climate change, but just our regular occurrences, we've had extremely mild winters. Our coolship season is very, very tiny. It basically stretches from around the holiday season into right now is about as far as we can stretch it. I think right now in Texas, actually it's in the 40s and 30s, so it's still coolship season for us. But it's a very small window. Again, we're a very small brewery. We only seek to make about 400 barrels a year of spontaneous beer. So in that context, it hasn't been a major threat per se. But I think of my one of, if not my favorite, the favorite brewery I have of all time. Cantillon, their cellar is not climate controlled. I've heard John talk about summers where it's maybe 80 Fahrenheit in the barrel room, and if our barrel room is insulated and refrigerated because our summers are highs of above 100, and if I heard it was even 80 degrees in our barrel room, I would start to freak out a little bit, and I would start to worry that we're going to have a bunch of acetic beer. And so I think that absolutely is a threat. Again, and this kind of goes into some of the the butting of heads we've had in the past with the Lambic community, where I remember I'm looking at Christian walking by, and I obviously we can't help but thinking of Armand's passing, recently, and obviously, cheers to Armand. We miss you, but gosh, I fully recognize for a lot of these producers, like that's their livelihood, like that's what they've done over generations. And again, we do like 400 barrels a year of it. Like, our jobs and livelihoods and families' futures don't depend on spontaneous. So I guess my point would be, in the context of like the global impact of climate change, we'll be fine at Jester King, but I do have an absolute worry for the broader community.
Category as a whole. Yeah. Absolutely. One of the things that I've always found to be inspirational about Jester King is that, starting from such a small seed that it is and still staying relatively small, the legacy of Jester King it's one of those breweries that so many other brewers seem to have touched at some point. And that really, in my experience from having talked to a lot of Belgian brewers, it really follows in that kind of tradition as well. A lot of people come through those houses, and a lot of people have come through your house. What does it mean to you? Like, how do you think about that legacy of, you're not just one of many wild ale producers anymore. Many of those wild ale producers came through Jester King one way or another. And it wasn't always their only stop, of course, but it was a big one. How do you think about that legacy and that role that you play as sort of a halfway house and for other people's dreams in addition to your own?
I mean, I truly love that. It's probably, other than the communal aspect that I mentioned before, which I see as an important part of our legacy, I would say that is really our biggest point of pride. I mentioned a moment ago desiring and having a real just hunger to be regarded as a really top wild ale producer in the world. We started to step into wine, and it's been nice where we don't have to kind of be burdened with that kind
no pressure on that one,
no
huh?
pressure. It's like we're going to make, a couple hundred cases a year. We want it to be good, but we're not trying to really just make this imprint on the wine world where, our hunger for that in the beer world has kind of subsided, where we're just kind of content just to be a solid producer and a nice place to visit. But 13 years ago when we were getting going, there absolutely was that hunger and competitiveness where we truly wanted to be regarded as a top wild ale producer, and to have seen kind of that, to use another sports analogy, kind of that coaching tree start to develop, and people, looking at us as not just a new brewery, and maybe I still kind of harbor that insecurity coming from like home brewer to professional brewer, where I still have that kind of insecurity over, we were just still trying to figure things out. I still have that insecurity, where now, to be looked upon, even though we're only a decade old, I feel like, it's like dog years in craft beer, where, a decade old brewery can be looked upon as like one of the kind of older producers.
You have a legacy in 10 years.
Has a legacy in 10 years. That feels very odd to me.
Yeah.
But, truly, as someone who did not get into this business, to try to, turn a quick profit and sell or anything like that, I very much hope, like Armand, to, pass on to a future generation. Like that, you just identified, like, truly the biggest point of pride that we have.
That's great to hear. Before I let Jeffrey go, does anybody have a burning question I'd like to ask him here in the last minute or so? Yeah, go ahead. Shout it out. So it sounds like what are some things you're proud to have, kind of won in sour beer? Like what have you achieved there, and then what are some things that you're annoyed by still? Oh, the perceptions and misrepresentations of the category. Understood. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, Ashley. For the bedrock of what we do, and I know there's a parallel here with lager, make it drinkable. That to me is the start and finish of brewing, whether it's, high gravity barley wine or 2% table beer. It should be drinkable, and I define that even if it's only a 4-ounce pour of a high gravity beer, you should still be like, oh, I'd love to have another 4-ounce pour of that, or I'd love to have 2 liters of table beer. Make it drinkable. So where I'm going with that is, we really try to impart that these are beers that should still be balanced, harmonious, have a nice malt character, hop character, have an interesting yeast complexity, not be screamingly sour. I feel like, we've maybe not done a good enough job kind of passing on that these are just fundamentally just like good drinkable beers. Like our former head brewer, Garrett Crowell, of Yokefellow Beer now, he said that, we're just making farmhouse pilsners, these are just like just good drinkable beers. And I feel like, we maybe haven't done a good enough job conveying that message, because I still feel like a lot of times it's like, how sour can we make this? How much just like insane like acidity coupled with this like kind of neutered beer that's just like layered with some fruit on top, unfermented fruit on top of it. And to me, that kind of misses the boat. And I'm all for whatever people want to do, but that kind of gets conflated with what we do. And so I don't think we've been maybe good enough storytellers along those lines. So that's kind of probably, my biggest point of annoyance. And, I appreciate, very much what Chris and his team are doing with an event like that to kind of tell a more cohesive narrative of this style of brewing.
It's a unique scenario, I think, for things that are polar opposite of each other to be assumed the same, right? I mean, the beers you're describing are some of the more gentle beers you could get. I mean, it's more gentle than like somebody might think a Miller Lite would be. It's going to be softer and rounder and like more enjoyable. And yet, it's in the same category as somebody that's something that's going to rip your face off. That's a problem.
Yes, it is. And going back to what I said before, just anecdotally, the amount of people who've come out to Jester King and said, I love your space, I love your goats, my kids love your pizza. I just can't drink sour beer. And I'm like, well, let me challenge you a little bit. Let me kind of help you kind of, broaden your horizons slightly along those lines. So that is a continuous battle to this day. We're not, fighting with Haral anymore, but we are still fighting with
families, just families now
right.
in general.
Yes.
That's great. All right, Jeffrey, thank you so much for spending the time with us again. I'm glad you made it this time.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Michael. Thank you very much. And thank you, Chris. Thank you, Green Betch.